let's try to handle some of the authentication since Laravel makes that so easy. So let's get rid of example test. But in project test, you'll see down here, we did specify that a project requires a title and a description, but it also needs an owner, right? So let's copy that and we'll say a project requires an owner. So now, if I remove this entirely, if I try to create a project but we don't specify who the owner of it is, I expect there to be an error. And I'm not sure what that should be called. We'll call it owner, but that may need to change. So I'm going to give this a run, and it does fail. Let's fix that. I'm going to go to our create projects table. And yes, a project needs a title and a description, but it also needs a owner. So we'll call that, let's do owner ID. And while we're here, let's also set up the foreign constraint. So we'll say the foreign key owner ID references the ID column on the users table. So we're saying this thing right here, this actually refers to the ID on the users table. And on the condition that the user deletes their account, I want to cascade down and delete all of the user's projects as well. So now, even locally, let's say PHP artisan migrate refresh. So this is only on our local end, but just to give you a visual example. So in our projects table, we now have this owner ID column. And you'll see that we do have the necessary constraint. Okay, so now, if we give this another run, I think we need to go ahead and turn off exception handling, because we don't want that to be cut. We do want to see the error. So we do have a constraint violation because we're not passing anything for owner ID. So let's take care of that. In database, project factory, a project now has an owner ID. I'm going to set this to a function, and this is where we will whip up whatever we need. In this case, a new user. Create and persist a user, and then return their ID. And that new user will be considered the owner of this project whenever we're testing. Okay, so think about it. Now we have all of the necessary attributes. We pass them to this post request. We then handle them here. So here, we'll skip right here, and we'll say at the very least, owner ID should be required. So now take a look. If I die and dump those validated attributes and run a test, we should have everything we need. So if we run it, it fails. Oh, of course, yeah, in this case, it's failing because, well, we whipped up a project, we did create an owner ID, and we passed everything that was necessary. So now I'm going to say owner ID is null, and then we'll assert the session has errors for that. Okay, so now if we comment this out and give it a run, it works. That's what we want. A project requires an owner. So now you'll notice because we set up our factory builder in this way, all of these are still going to work even though we did change the requirements list. That's the benefit to that approach. However, I'm still going to change this a bit. Yes, we could pass the owner ID through the request, but in general, I don't like to do that. Instead, I like to be fully in charge of setting who the owner is. That way I'm not having to worry about if somebody interfered with the request data and they changed the owner. That's something I'm going to be responsible for. So this is where, and we talked about this in Laravel from scratch, we can do it this way and then refactor to use eloquent relationships. So we'll do it in 2 steps. Attributes owner ID equals the authenticated user, and then I will remove that entirely as a validation step. Now, I'm no longer performing validation on the owner ID. Instead, I want my validation to be at the middleware level. You have to be signed in order to access this method. So let's tweak this just a little bit. If you have a project and you try to create it, but you're not signed in, you're a guest user, well, I'm going to instead assert that you are redirected to the login page. Okay, let's give that a run. All right, it looks like we got a 500 error. So it's still trying to access this data. And in fact, you should see, here we are. If we run it, yep, so we're accessing that method, even though we wanted to say, you shouldn't even get to this point if you're not signed in. Okay, and of course, by the way, you would see that again. Add something like this to a little snippet, because you're going to reach for it all the time. And you'll turn it on and off. Yeah, now we have a more direct error message. We're back to that constraint violation, because we're accessing the method when we shouldn't even have called it in the first place. Okay, routes, web, and we'll say right here, you need to be signed in. So I'll set middleware off. Now, if I give it a run, route login is not defined. Of course, we're trying to redirect to the named route login, but it hasn't been defined. So this is where I can run phpartisan make auth and let Laravel help me. You'll see that does a number of things. It will set up our auth controllers for verification, resetting a password, signing in, lots of stuff there. And it will also set up in my resources directory, it'll give us some initial layout files. And that's why I'd been holding off on that. So now if I give our test a run again, okay, now we're getting an authentication exception. So an exception was thrown. Laravel did not gracefully handle it because we had this turned on. So if I turn that off, Laravel will pick up on the exception and translate that into a redirect to the login page. And we get green. Yay. Okay, so now we can say only authenticated users can create projects. So we switched from a validation test over to a middleware test. And I can take this, and where do I want that? How about right here? Okay, let's run all of our tests. And they're starting to fail. Good. This is why we have them. So all of these, again, are running into the same issue. So let's do these one by one. A project requires a title. Okay, we need to sign in a user now. Acting as factory for a user and create that. So create a brand new user and set them as the authenticated person. Now, if I run it, that one's back to green. Great. Let's do the same thing for this one. Project requires a description, fails. Let's sign somebody in, and now it passes. Let's run all of the tests now for the class. And we have just this last issue. Yeah, once again, we get an authentication exception for a user can create a project. That will be right up here. Let's make sure that we sign you in. So this is a situation where we might want to add a little helper function. But let's run it. And now all of our tests are passing. So why don't we finish up by switching back to projects controller, and we can do a bit of refactoring. Yes, we can do it like this, but I might prefer to do something like this. Get me the authenticated user, projects, create, and then I would just give them the attributes. And that way, the owner ID will be set automatically. Okay, let's see if that works. And I'm going to switch back, and let's only work on one test. How about this one here? Okay, that of course fails because there is no relationship between a user and projects. So this is a situation where we have our feature test. We're now testing a method on a class that doesn't exist. So this again is a good opportunity to drop down and make a new test. phpartisan make test, user test, which is a unit test, or again, I treat these as model tests. All right, so we'll have our test here. A user has projects. So you can do it like this for shorthand. You can do a full sentence if you want. Honestly, I don't mind either one. Sometimes it can be redundant when it's already clear that you're working with a user. So some people do that. It doesn't matter. Okay, so let's say, given I have a user, well, a user can access their projects. So if we run that, that should give us an instance of an Eloquent collection class. So let me pull that in. Illuminate database Eloquent collection. Okay, and let's use refresh database. Pull that back in and give it a run. Okay, failed asserting that null is an instance of class collection. Of course, if we open up our user class, we don't have that method. So a user can have projects. That will be has many. One user can have any number of projects. Okay, now if I give it a run, we get no such column projects user ID. So notice that because our class is called user and we're trying to access the user's projects, by default, Eloquent is going to look for the projects table and specifically a column called user ID. So take a look. It's going to look for user ID, but we called it owner ID. So if you buck the convention, you need to make sure you override it. That column is actually owner ID, not user ID. And now we get green. Excellent. So we have our test written. This functionality now works. We can now jump back up to our previous test, which is this one. So you'll see, you often do that. You have a feature test, you hit a snag, you drop down, you write some more tests, then you jump back up to the feature test. I thought that would pass. Integrity constraints. So we still have a constraint violation with owner ID. So get the attributes. That should be gone. Oh, yeah. And then we're still creating the project twice. So now I can remove this entirely, and we end up with something like this. Or again, if you want to blow the roof off the place, you can do this number here. But yeah, a lot of people do that. So we give it a run now, and there we go. We're now returning green. And let's do projects test. Yeah, all of those tests are now currently passing. Great. So we've set up authentication. We've also ensured that you can't create a project unless you're currently signed in. And if you are signed in, we'll ensure that you are set as the owner of every project you create. So in the next lesson, I want to ensure that when we view our projects, we're only seeing the ones that we created versus what we currently have, which shows you all projects that everyone has created for the lifetime of the site. Clearly not what we want. So this will be handled in the next episode. I'll see you then.